Good morning. This story is a first-person autobiographical account by Ruth Wright, the founder of the global search engine Scraggy. She details her journey from a modest life in Essex to becoming an ultra-wealthy tech mogul after her autistic daughter Lilith intuitively develops a revolutionary AI-driven search code. It talks of Ruth's past, including the tragic loss of her husband and her struggles to protect her family from intrusive media scrutiny. Scrutiny, even. Supported by her loyal friend Josie Van and a group of local investors, Ruth navigates the challenges of extreme fame and sudden fortune. Her account includes her moving the family onto a custom-built super yacht in order to try and find security. But in the end, her story serves as a personal reflection on wealth, motherhood, and the loss of privacy in the digital age. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the AI voices. And if you would like to subscribe and ring that bell, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Enjoy.
Usually when we hear about the origins of a massive, world-altering tech empire, there is a very specific, almost comforting expectation of a blueprint.
Right, we have this whole collective cultural mythology about it.
Exactly. We picture, like, a Stanford dropout, maybe a brightly lit garage in Palo Alto.
Yeah, a whiteboard just covered in complex predictive equations.
And some venture capitalist in a fleece vest pointing at a prototype and going, yep, that's the future.
It's a very calculated, hyper-rational narrative. I mean, we like our geniuses to fit into a recognizable, predictable mold.
Because it makes the resulting shift in our world feel manageable, right?
Exactly. We want the ascent from ordinary to extraordinary to make logical sense. It's the illusion of control.
But then you step into the cramped living room of a single mother in suburban Essex, and suddenly that pristine blueprint is completely shredded.
Oh, entirely. It's just gone.
We're looking at an origin story today that is, honestly, terrifyingly accidental. It completely defies that whole Silicon Valley template.
It really is the absolute definition of navigating uncharted waters without a compass. What we are exploring today is an anomaly that disrupts every standard model of technological development.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are bringing you into a story that feels like it was ripped straight from a dystopian thriller, but every single detail is entirely real.
Which is the wildest part.
We are unpacking a deeply personal, incredibly raw autobiography titled Downfall. This is the life story of Ruth Wright.
And at its core, this is a story about a woman, her profoundly autistic savant daughter, Lilith, and just a mother's unbelievable, almost supernatural strength to continue.
Yeah, pushing forward through unimaginable tragedy and catastrophic betrayal. Okay, let's unpack this.
It is a staggering narrative to synthesize. We are going to trace the creation of a trillion-pound artificial intelligence search engine.
An entity known simply as Scraggy.
Right, Scraggy, which was built essentially on a cheap desktop computer in that suburban living room.
But more than the tech, we're going to examine the isolating, almost paralyzing terror of overnight extreme wealth.
And ultimately, we have to navigate a completely devastating public fall from grace. My role today is to look beyond just the dizzying timeline of Ruth's rise and fall.
We really need to get into the psychological mechanics at play here.
Exactly. We are going to look at the resilience required to simply survive a life that volatile.
And if you're listening and wondering why a story about a trillion-pound AI matters to your daily life, it's because this deep dive examines the ultimate what-if scenario.
The scariest what if, really.
Yeah, what if your child's quiet after-school hobby inadvertently made you the richest, most powerful, and eventually the most hated person on planet Earth?
How do you even survive when the world decides to punish you for an accident of genius?
To understand how Ruth survives the brutal end of this unbelievable story, we have to look at the psychological foundation that was built at the very beginning.
And her origins are incredibly ordinary, almost aggressively normal, you know?
She was born in Newcastle in 1976, but moved to Leigh-on-Sea in Essex when she was just a baby.
Just a standard, unremarkable 1930s suburban house.
But that completely ordinary setting contained her earliest and perhaps most vital lessons in psychological adaptation.
Because of her younger sister, Charla.
Right, Charla was autistic.
Yeah.
And the source text gives us this incredibly vivid, defining memory from Ruth's childhood.
Yeah, the incident with Cousin Anne.
So they had this cousin, Anne, who came to stay over. And one afternoon, Anne, just out of sheer childhood malice, tears apart Charlotte's beloved doll collection.
She just scattered the heads, the arms, the legs all over the bedroom floor.
The detail that really stuck with me from the book is that when Ruth's mother finally figured out why Charlotte was having such a severe, inconsolable meltdown, it wasn't actually because the physical plastic of the dolls was broken.
No, that wasn't the tragedy for her at all.
It was because the dolls no longer occupied the exact specific spatial coordinates where they quote-unquote belonged in the room.
That spatial disruption, the sudden chaos of her environment, was the true trauma for Charlotte.
And that's a crucial distinction in understanding neurodivergence, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And it serves as Ruth's earliest exposure to it, long before she would have her own neurodivergent child.
It was like a primer for what was coming.
Exactly. For many individuals on the autism spectrum, the physical arrangement of their environment is an extension of their internal cognitive state.
So when Cousin Anne disrupted the physical space, she was effectively shattering Charlotte's internal mental order.
Right. It taught Ruth a profound lesson early on: reality is experienced subjectively.
What seems trivial to one person, like a messy room, can be an apocalyptic event to someone else.
It taught her that order is a deeply fragile construct.
Which is a lesson she is forced to learn in a much more devastating personal way when she is just 10 years old.
Yeah, the story with her father.
Her father, a Navy lieutenant who had this quirky, almost obsessive love for swimming in freezing cold water, drowns while the family is on holiday in Lyme Regis.
He went out for a routine morning swim in the ocean and just never came back.
The sea just took him. His body was never found. And Ruth's absolute last memory of him is him standing there, promising to buy her a plastic dinosaur later that day.
The suddenness of it, the sheer lack of closure in that loss, is critical to her psychological development.
The foundation of her family is literally swallowed by the sea without warning.
There's no illness to prepare for, no goodbye. It forces Ruth to develop a highly pragmatic, survival-oriented mindset very early on.
She learns that safety is an illusion. You can be promised a plastic dinosaur one minute, and the person making the promise can be gone the next.
She carries that heavy pragmatism right into young adulthood. I mean, she doesn't go to a fancy university.
No, she's working as a checkout girl at Tesco, and that is where she meets Martin.
And they just fall completely head over heels in love.
The book describes this incredibly intense, almost codependent relationship where they're simply never apart.
They are each other's entire world.
And then this bizarre plot twist happens. Martin's aunt dies and leaves him 22,000 pounds.
Which, in the 90s, for two kids working at Tesco, that was a massive, life-altering chunk of change.
It acts as the catalyst for what we might affectionately call their hippie phase.
Oh, the Robin Reliant.
Yes. They buy a bright pink Robin Reliant, one of those three-wheeled cars they moved down to Cornwall, and they essentially light that entire inheritance on fire.
Through a series of remarkably naive, idealistic business ventures.
It honestly reads like a sitcom. First, they try to run a laundromat, which fails.
Then they open a healing crystal shop, which fails.
A flotation tank salon. They even open an astrology center where, by her own admission, neither of them knows the first thing about astrology.
Which is just wild. They even impulsively buy a 200-year-old stone cottage in the middle of the pouring rain.
Only to immediately realize upon moving in that they have absolutely no way to generate income to feed themselves.
The contrast between Ruth and Martin here is really illuminating, though. Martin is the dreamer, propelled by whimsy and the sudden influx of cash.
But Ruth goes along with it out of love. You can see her underlying pragmatism constantly clashing with his idealism, though.
Right, because when the money inevitably evaporates, it's Ruth who grounds them. They retreat to London, they get married, and they have their daughter Lilith.
They attempt to build a normal life. But then, another massive earthquake hits her life.
This part is just heartbreaking.
When Lilith is just an infant, Ruth wakes up in the middle of the night. She feels an unnatural absence of heat on Martin's side of the bed.
She reaches out, touches his leg with her toes, and it is ice cold.
He died suddenly in his sleep of an undiagnosed natural cause. He was incredibly young, just gone in the night.
The somatic memory of that cold leg is something Ruth emphasizes deeply in the text, and her psychological response to this trauma is fascinating.
She doesn't just mourn, right? She immediately and legally reverts to her maiden name, right?
Exactly. And she decides to raise Lilith entirely under that name. She later explains this not as an insult to Martin's memory, but as a visceral survival mechanism.
She felt that if she held on to his name, the identity of being his wife, she would metaphorically die with him.
The grief was so absolute that she needed to sever that specific identity just to force her physical body to keep living and caring for her newborn.
I really want to look at the architecture of her life at this point. It feels like Ruth's entire early life is like trying to build a stable house directly on top of an active fault line.
That's a great way to put it.
She experiences the spatial trauma of her sister, the sudden vanishing of her father, the chaotic financial ruin in Cornwall, and now the literal overnight death of her husband.
She is just constantly bracing for the next tremor.
Does living like that actually make a person stronger? Or does it just trap them in a state of exhausting hypervigilance?
It's a vital question. In Ruth's specific case, the trauma acts as a form of psychological inoculation.
Inoculation, like a vaccine.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yes, she is undeniably traumatized and she carries deep scars, but she is permanently inoculated against the illusion of stability.
Ah, I see. Most of us walk around believing the ground beneath us is solid. Ruth knows for a fact that it isn't.
Because she had learned so early that life is deeply, fundamentally unstable, she was uniquely, perhaps perfectly, equipped to handle the impossible anomalies her daughter soon began to exhibit.
The reality-bending stuff.
Right. When the rules of reality start to work around Lilith, Ruth doesn't panic because Ruth's reality had never been rigid to begin with.
That perfectly sets the stage for Lilith, the spark of genius in this story. Because Ruth had adapted to the unpredictable, she just rolled with it when Lilith was formally identified as an autistic savant.
And the early clues of Lilith's condition are wild.
Yeah, Lilith had this specific quirk where she loved having colored ribbons tied in her hair, but they had to be rotated in a strict, seemingly incomprehensible order.
And Ruth discovered one day that Lilith could accurately predict exactly what color ribbon she would be wearing on an impossible, distant future date.
Ruth could say, "Lilith, what color ribbon will you wear on June 13, 2032?
And Lilith would pause, her eyes would sort of track an invisible calendar in the air, and she would say, "Red."
And if Ruth mapped out the rotation, Lilith was always 100% right.
We're talking about a phenomenon known as calendrical calculation, which is observed in a small subset of prodigious savants.
What exactly does that entail?
It involves an unconscious, rapid algorithmic processing of temporal data. It's a staggering cognitive ability, essentially seeing time not as a linear experience, but as a vast, immediately accessible mathematical grid.
But, as is often the case, this profound internal architecture came with severe deficits in external social functioning.
Right, Lilith lived entirely in her own world.
She spent her days drawing hyper-detailed, incredibly complex landscapes and mechanical schematics, barely speaking, barely interacting with anyone around her. She was locked inside her own mind.
Until the year 2004, this is the moment the universe essentially tilts on its axis for them.
Ruth buys a cheap, secondhand Apple eMac. She just wants to practice some basic business and typing skills.
And Lilith, who is 5 years old at this time, sees the glowing screen.
She walks up to her mother and, in a rare moment of verbal engagement, politely asks, "Me try, please."
So Ruth opens a blank Word document, expecting Lilith to just mash the keys.
But Lilith completely ignores the alphabet. Her tiny fingers fly over the keyboard, and she inputs an incredibly dense, complex sequence of characters.
Just lines of raw code.
Right. And when Ruth stops her and asks what it means, Lilith just looks at the screen and says one single word: useful.
What's fascinating here is that the original source material sometimes characterizes this as a child just typing a few lines of basic binary. But when we dig into what actually happened, it's far more profound.
Ruth prints this document out, a piece of paper she's later offered £4 million for, by the way, and takes it to a local college computer technician named Jimmy Banks.
Banks expects to just humor a proud mother. Instead, he is completely baffled.
He identifies the sequence not as random zeros and ones, but as a highly compressed, radically novel algorithmic routing protocol.
Written essentially in assembly-level logic, it bypassed standard data retrieval methods entirely.
To put it in perspective, it's akin to a toddler sitting at a piano and flawlessly composing a Mozart symphony on their first try.
But the symphony is also a functional, structurally sound architectural blueprint for a suspension bridge. It was alien, but it was perfect.
And from that exact moment, the computer becomes Lilith's entire reality. When she isn't sitting at the keyboard, the book describes her as almost zombie-like, completely disconnected from her surroundings.
But the second she hears that iconic mass chime turning on, it's like a power switch is flipped.
Her spine straightens, her eyes light up. She comes alive. But looking at this as an outsider, I have to ask, isn't it incredibly dangerous to let a 7-year-old savant have unrestricted, completely unmonitored access to the web?
It's a completely natural protective reaction to think that.
You are essentially handing a child who doesn't understand human malice a direct portal to the entire internet.
But we have to look closely at the profound isolation of raising a prodigious savant. Ruth admits candidly in the text that she wasn't an expert on autism.
She didn't have a team of neuropsychologists advising her.
Exactly. She just desperately wanted to understand and connect with her child. That computer was Lilith's only real lifeline, her only mode of true active engagement with the world outside her own mind.
So Ruth was absolutely terrified of severing that connection.
She felt she couldn't take it away despite the inherent, obvious risks of the early internet. It was a choice between her daughter's safety and her daughter's soul.
And amazingly, that unrestricted access didn't lead to the dark corners of the web, at least not initially. It led to a creation so monumental, it permanently altered the fabric of their reality.
And that is the unveiling of Scraggy.
One day, Lilith calls her mother and her mother's lifelong best friend, Josie, into the bedroom.
The computer screen is glowing this lurid, almost aggressive shade of green.
At the very top is a grainy digital photo of their rescue dog, Scraggy. He was a scruffy mongrel whose one defining trait was that he was incredibly, doggedly good at finding lost things in the yard.
And underneath the photo is a single blinking search bar.
Which seems so simple, right?
But Scraggy wasn't just a quirky website. It was an entirely new paradigm of artificial intelligence, built completely in secret by a child.
When Josie sits down and types in a simple word like CK Nick, the screen doesn't just generate a static list of blue hyperlinks like early Google or Yahoo.
No, it generates a moving, dynamic, interactive montage.
And pulls static images, plays videos, overlays audio clips, generates pop-up definitions, and maps geographical data simultaneously.
It synthesized disparate types of information in a way that completely defied the bandwidth and processing limitations of the 2007 internet.
Lilith hadn't just built an index. She had created an algorithm that imitated step-by-step human reasoning, using probabilistic modeling to solve search queries using logic, not just keyword matching.
Ruth and Josie are staring at the screen, and they slowly realize they are sitting on a nuclear reactor of intellectual property.
But there's a massive problem. Ruth doesn't have a background in tech. She doesn't have venture capital backing.
She's literally living on government benefits at this point.
So they execute this wonderfully analog testing phase. They spend 4.5 months sneaking into the local public library.
They secretly test Scraggy by feeding it 150 incredibly complex, multi-layered questions spanning algebra, astronomy, ancient history.
And then they manually check Scraggy's output against the physical Encyclopedia Britannica.
Scraggy scores 100%. Every single time. It never hallucinates. It never misses.
The transition from that moment of realization to actual commercial execution is driven almost entirely by Josie, right?
Yes, Ruth is paralyzed by the scale of what is sitting on her daughter's hard drive. She likens the feeling to standing on the edge of a sheer cliff with a bomb strapped to her chest.
She intuitively knows this is too big for them. But Josie pushes her. Josie believes in it.
In a massive leap of faith, Josie secretly sells Ruth's car to fund the server space and legal fees required for the launch.
They form a limited company, they set a subscription price, and they launch Scraggy into the wild on December 6, 2007.
Which poetically happens to be Lilith's birthday.
And the launch is terrifyingly anticlimactic. For the first entire week, there is dead silence, not a single ping.
Ruth thinks she has failed again, just like the crystal shop in Cornwall.
But then, a random Saturday arrives. One single sale registered from a computer in America.
Then, an hour later, 8 sales.
By the end of the day, 71. The next day, 266. By week 6, the virality curve goes vertical.
They have sold almost 1 million subscriptions globally. The math becomes incomprehensible.
We constantly fantasize in our culture about overnight success. But for Ruth, this instant, exponential wealth is actually a nightmare disguised as a lottery win.
The trauma of sudden astronomical wealth is vastly underestimated in our society. We view money strictly as a liberator, but at this scale, it acts as a suffocating restraint.
Ruth's ordinary life instantly disintegrates.
The sheer volume of incoming capital triggers massive anti-money laundering or AML algorithms across the banking sector.
Because retail banks are terrified of compliance fines, And an Essex single mother receiving millions of pounds a day from random global IP addresses looks exactly like a digital cartel.
The banks threaten to freeze her accounts, treating her like a criminal. Furthermore, the global press uncovers her address.
They physically invade her quiet suburban street in Leigh-on-Sea. Satellites are parked outside, reporters are banging on the windows.
And the physical toll is incredible.
Post office vans start arriving just to deliver the begging letters. Literal massive mailbags filled with heartbreaking, desperate pleas for money are dumped in her hallway.
The psychological weight of knowing you could save all these people but physically can't process the volume is crushing.
Her mother, who lives nearby, is so deeply distressed by the media circus that she has to be put on prescription sleeping pills just to function. They lose every ounce of autonomy.
The money becomes a literal cage. They cannot walk to the grocery store. Lilith's schooling and therapy stop entirely because they can't leave the house safely.
They are trapped inside with the curtains permanently drawn, watching their bank balance at zeros while their world shrinks to the size of a living room.
Because their suburban life had become completely untenable, Ruth has to take extreme, almost cinematic measures to physically separate her family from the world.
The pressure cooker explodes. They execute a midnight escape.
They pack whatever they can carry and flee in the middle of the night to a heavily guarded, gated community in Norfolk, a place called Squire's House.
All arranged in secret by Josie and her husband, Dave.
It is during this period of extreme isolation in Norfolk that Ruth makes a crucial decision. She uses her new wealth to hire Sally.
Sally is a highly specialized live-in carer for her adult sister, Charla.
And Sally is a pivotal figure in this narrative. She brings a strict, no-nonsense approach to the household.
She isn't intimidated by Ruth's billions, and she isn't overwhelmed by Charla's autism.
She demands structure, routine, and clear boundaries, which finally brings Charla a sense of grounded stability she had never experienced before.
But even the vast gated grounds of Norfolk aren't enough for Ruth. The trauma of the press invasion has left her deeply paranoid.
She craves absolute, impenetrable space, a moat between her and humanity.
So she commissions a 73 million pound custom-built yacht. It isn't a pleasure cruiser. It is a literal floating fortress.
And rather than sailing the Riviera, she has it permanently moored in the gray, freezing waters of the Thames estuary.
She hires a massive staff, private chefs, marine engineers, a full security detail, but insists they all sleep on land, except for Sally.
Ruth spends 699 nights on this boat, just staring out at the water, trying to feel safe.
But then disaster strikes. In the autumn of 2011, the fortress fails. The yacht explodes.
It's a catastrophic structural failure deep in the hull. An engineer, Mr. Woodsman, is tragically killed in the blast.
And Ruth, who, despite her father's love of the water, never actually learned to swim properly, is violently thrown into the freezing estuary alongside Lilith and Charla.
It is a moment of pure, terrifying chaos.
It is Sally who dives in, physically secures the two girls, and then swims back against the current to save Ruth, pulling her away just moments before the lower section of the boat completely detonates and sinks.
It's an incredible, cinematic sequence of events.
But thinking about the psychology behind it, Ruth built this massive floating fortress to protect her family from the abstract social danger of the public and the media.
Right.
By trying to outrun that abstract fear, did she actually place them in literal physical danger?
It is a profound, tragic irony. She utilized her infinite resources to build a fortress to escape the world, and that very fortress nearly became her family's watery tomb.
The isolation she purchased almost killed them.
But what is truly remarkable from a neurological perspective is the physiological aftermath of this event on Lilith.
The severe shock of the freezing water, the sheer terror of the event, induces what medical professionals later described as a reset in Lilith's brain.
The cold water reset.
It is impossible to ignore the poetry here. It echoes her father's death in the cold water of Lyme Regis.
It brings this whole narrative theme of water, trauma, and transformation full circle.
The water that took her father is the water that fundamentally alters her daughter. After being pulled from the Thames, Lilith, who had been almost entirely nonverbal her entire life, suddenly begins speaking.
The leading hypothesis is that the extreme shock triggered the mammalian dive reflex, coupled with a massive vagus nerve stimulation.
Which somehow disrupted the rigid neural pathways that had kept her nonverbal.
Exactly. She suddenly becomes a chatterbox. Now her speech is entirely peppered with raw facts and data, maintaining all the hallmarks of her neurodivergence.
She doesn't suddenly become neurotypical.
Not at all. She remains deeply obsessed with coding the next iterations of Scraggy and playing highly complex, violent Dungeons and Dragons-style fantasy games.
But that impenetrable wall of silence between her and her mother is finally broken.
The destruction of the yacht forces Ruth back to land. She can't hide on the water anymore.
Surprisingly, the local town of Leigh-on-Sea rallies around them after the accident. The locals leave flowers, they respect their privacy, showing this massive outpouring of genuine human empathy.
So Ruth decides to stay. She buys up a block of houses, sets up a massive security perimeter, and tries to establish a new, ultra-wealthy normal.
And this tentative step back into society brings her straight into the path of a man who will methodically, ruthlessly dismantle her entire life.
This introduces us to Sam, and the beginning of the true downfall.
To understand how Sam infiltrates her life, we have to understand Ruth's profound loneliness. Despite being a trillionaire, she has absolutely no peer group.
She can't relate to old money aristocrats, and she can't relate to her old friends from Tesco.
So she starts dating incognito. It's a form of stealth wealth dating.
She puts on cheap high street clothes, wears a brunette wig, and goes to local coffee shops with her nurse friend Olivia just to feel the illusion of normalcy.
She just wants to be a face in the crowd, and that's where she meets a local barista named Sam.
He asks her out. She accepts, but she lies about her identity.
She creates a fake backstory because she desperately wants him to like her, the woman, not her bank account or her public persona.
But you can't hide a trillion-pound AI empire forever. Eventually, the truth comes out.
And Sam's reaction is what's chilling. He doesn't panic. He doesn't feel intimidated.
He adapts to extreme wealth with a terrifying, almost predatory ease. He drops the barista apron, slips into bespoke tuxedos, and seamlessly marries Ruth.
But there are immediate red flags for anyone paying attention. Josie, who has known Ruth her whole life, inherently dislikes him.
And Lilith, at the actual wedding reception, pulls Ruth aside and whispers, "Why doesn't Aunt Josie and your new husband like each other?"
Children, particularly neurodivergent children who process the world through pure observation rather than social conditioning, often strip away polite social niceties and observe the raw underlying dynamics of a room.
Lilith saw the friction instantly. Sam begins a subtle but methodical campaign of alienating Ruth from her loyal inner circle.
He acts as a gatekeeper. But the true catalyst for Ruth's destruction isn't Sam, at least not directly.
It is a local, horrific tragedy that provides the spark.
The school disaster. It's incredibly heavy. A local principal, a woman named Mrs. Fitzgerald, approaches Ruth's philanthropic foundation for a massive grant to upgrade her primary school's aging safety and infrastructure systems.
Ruth, wanting to support the community, initially agrees to the funding.
But then, bizarrely, Mrs. Fitzgerald shows up completely unannounced on Ruth's heavily guarded doorstep.
She is screaming at Ruth, calling her vile names, accusing her of hoarding wealth and hating children.
Ruth is shocked, deeply offended, and furious. So she officially withdraws the funding offer.
2 weeks later, the school suffers a catastrophic gas explosion. 103 children are killed.
It is an unprecedented civilian disaster. The grief in the community is bottomless, and the public reaction is swift, brutal, and entirely misdirected.
Mrs. Fitzgerald, traumatized and looking for an outlet for her own guilt, goes straight to the national media.
She broadcast the narrative that Ruth Wright, the trillionaire, maliciously withheld the exact safety funds that could have prevented the explosion and saved those children.
The public, whipped into a frenzy by the tabloids, unequivocally blames Ruth.
I really want to pause and dissect the psychology here. She didn't cause the explosion. It was a faulty gas line.
Right.
She simply becomes a massive lightning rod.
Yeah.
She didn't create the storm, but because of her immense, highly visible profile and her unfathomable wealth, she attracted all the devastating energy of the public's grief.
If the town was a circuit board, she's the biggest resistor, and all the voltage hit her. If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is a perfect way to conceptualize the psychology of public scapegoating, which aligns closely with sociological theories on mimetic desire and the scapegoat mechanism.
Because society simply could not process the random, senseless tragedy of 103 dead children.
The human brain abhors a vacuum of meaning. It demands a narrative, and more importantly, it demands a tangible villain to punish.
The public couldn't direct their bottomless anger at a rusted underground pipe or the abstract physics of gas combustion.
So they focus their collective blinding rage on the isolated, unimaginably wealthy tech CEO who had publicly withdrawn funding.
The actual boring facts of the timeline that a massive infrastructural upgrade couldn't possibly have been contracted and completed in 2 weeks anyway did not matter in the slightest.
The emotional narrative was set, and Ruth was the monster.
The hatred directed at her is so intense, so physically overwhelming, that she suffers a catatonic collapse during a disastrous press conference.
Her own private security team advises her that her life is in imminent, credible danger in England. They tell her to flee.
So she retreats to a remote 16th century castle she owns in Scotland, seeking isolation again.
She is completely crushed by the weight of global hatred. She believes she is a monster.
And this profound depression pushes her to the absolute breaking point, leading to an irreversible, fatal mistake.
This is the darkest turning point in her life. The crash in the cell.
Fleeing the media helicopters, deeply depressed, and having consumed a significant amount of alcohol, Ruth decides to drive her massive, armored Bentley through the blinding Scottish rain.
She loses control on a curve and hits a Volkswagen Passat head-on.
The sheer physics of the crash, the weight and velocity of her reinforced Bentley against a standard family car, destroy the smaller vehicle.
She kills a family of 5 instantly, including a 6-month-old baby.
I want to be very clear here, and the source material is very clear as well. Ruth is guilty of this. There's no conspiracy, no scapegoating here.
She was twice over the legal blood alcohol limit.
She never asks for pity regarding the accident in her autobiography. She acknowledges she killed 5 innocent people through her own reckless despair.
The trauma of waking up and realizing exactly what she had done pushes her back into a severe catatonic breakdown in the hospital.
She is completely unreachable. She has to be treated for months by a specialist psychiatrist, Professor Iona Carmichael, just to become communicative and stable enough to physically stand trial.
She enters a guilty plea and is sentenced to 36 months in Grampian prison for manslaughter.
And this is where the corporate thriller aspect of the story violently collides with the personal tragedy.
While Ruth is sitting in a cold cell, agonizing over the unbearable guilt of taking 5 lives, dealing with prison inmates who despise her, Sam executes a ruthless, legally brilliant, and entirely sociopathic coup.
He betrays her completely and utterly. While she's locked up, he quietly files for divorce.
But it's not just a divorce, it's a hostile takeover.
He uses her incarceration, her documented mental health struggles, specifically the catatonia and the intense public hatred, to seize total control of her assets.
He utilizes closed-door high court hearings, likely leveraging the UK's Court of Protection frameworks, to argue that Ruth is incapacitated and legally unfit to manage her empire.
He gains full custody of Lilith, who, we must remember, is the actual biological key to updating and maintaining Scraggy's code.
He immediately fires Ruth's incredibly loyal staff, including her dedicated estate manager, Mr. Jeffrey. He essentially wipes Ruth off the map.
If we examine the mechanics of Sam's predatory opportunism, it is chillingly effective.
He didn't just steal her money using a forged signature, he weaponized her very real guilt and trauma against her.
He utilized the justice system and public opinion to execute a flawless, hostile takeover of her trillion-pound empire and her child.
He recognized that Ruth was entirely too toxic for anyone to publicly defend. Who is going to champion the rights of a billionaire drunk driver who the public already believes killed 100 school children?
No one. Sam capitalized on her complete social isolation perfectly.
Which leads us to absolute rock bottom. After serving her time, Ruth is released from Grampian.
She is stripped of her wealth, her company, her husband, and most devastatingly, her child. She is released into a world that actively, vocally despises her.
Josie, her ever-loyal friend, who has been legally barred from the tech empire, has scraped together enough money to buy a dilapidated, abandoned dairy farm for Ruth to live in, far away from the press.
Ruth has literally nothing but the clothes she walked out of prison in.
And the humiliations she faces upon re-entry are immediate, systemic, and visceral.
She attempts to cash a modest check that Josie gave her just to buy groceries and survive.
3 different high street banks outright refuse to let her open a basic checking account because her name triggers every reputational risk algorithm they have.
She is a politically exposed person of the worst kind. The bank tellers recognize her face. She is the multiple child murderer to them.
In a fit of sheer despair and public humiliation, she tears the check to pieces in the middle of the bank lobby and is physically escorted out by security guards while everyday people film her breakdown on their phones.
The woman who was, mere years ago, worth £1 trillion, who dined with royalty and shaped global digital architecture, is now riding a rusty, squeaky bicycle she ironically calls the Iron Donkey.
She rides it in the rain down to the local government office to apply for universal credit and a basic carer's allowance.
Because the tragedy, incredibly, doesn't stop with her incarceration. Sam, who now fully controls the purse strings of the estate, cruelly and abruptly cuts the private funding for Ruth's mother's specialized nursing home.
The nursing home, acting with shocking callousness once the money stops, literally puts her mother, who is suffering from severe late-stage dementia, into an ambulance and dumps her at Ruth's freezing, dilapidated farmhouse.
Ruth, who has absolutely no medical training, no specialized equipment, and barely enough money to heat the room, has to care for her entirely alone until her mother tragically dies of pneumonia shortly after.
And then the final unimaginable blow lands.
Charla, Ruth's autistic sister, who had been living somewhat independently in town with Sally's continued help, goes to the local grocery store just to buy a pint of milk.
She is spotted and recognized by a grieving, deeply unstable mother. One of the actual mothers who lost a child in the school gas explosion years prior.
The woman, blinded by misdirected rage, violently attacks Charla in the middle of the store aisle. Charla falls, suffers a massive head injury, slips into a coma, and dies.
The compounding depth of this loss is almost mathematically impossible for the human brain to process without fracturing.
Think about the sheer weight of it. Imagine falling from 1 trillion pounds to riding a rusty bike to sign on for welfare.
While simultaneously burying your mother, who died of corporate neglect, and your sister, who is murdered in a grocery store aisle because the world blames you for a tragedy you didn't commit.
Add to that the very real guilt of the 5 people you actually did kill in the car crash. How do you wake up the next morning? How do you not just end it all?
This is where the core theme of the entire autobiography and our deep dive today completely solidifies a mother's strength.
Ruth is brutally honest. She explicitly states that she thought about ending her life. It would have been the easiest escape.
But she doesn't, because her primal biological need to protect and reunite with Lilith keeps her tethered to the earth.
She knows deep in her bones that Lilith is trapped with Sam, a man who views her only as an algorithm-generating machine.
That singular burning focus on her daughter becomes her ultimate survival mechanism. It overrides the grief.
Because Ruth absolutely refused to break, she inadvertently became the quiet, beating center of a covert counterattack.
An undercover operation is launched not by high-priced corporate lawyers, but by the very few, very ordinary, loyal people she had left in her corner.
And the absolute linchpin of this operation is a woman named Mrs. Henderson.
We have to rewind the timeline slightly to understand the profound loyalty of Mrs. Henderson.
Years prior, during the height of her wealth, Ruth had read about Mrs. Henderson, a local housekeeper who was facing a murder charge after she killed her violently, historically abusive husband in sheer self-defense.
Ruth stepped in. She used her massive legal resources to fund Mrs. Henderson's defense, getting the charge reduced to manslaughter with a suspended sentence, effectively saving the woman's life.
And then Ruth hired her. Ruth didn't just hire her to look good for the press. She treated her with genuine dignity when the world viewed her as a criminal.
And now, years later, the tables have turned. Mrs. Henderson is the head housekeeper inside Sam's heavily guarded, opulent compound.
She is the invisible inside spy, and what she discovers happening behind those closed doors is horrifying.
Mrs. Henderson uncovers the foundational poisonous lie of Ruth's entire downfall. She discovers exactly why Mrs. Fitzgerald, the school principal, showed up screaming at Ruth on her doorstep years ago.
Sam had secretly approached the principal beforehand. He gaslit her entirely.
He told Mrs. Fitzgerald that Ruth secretly hated her charity, hated the local school, and was actively disgusted by the funding request.
Sam purposefully incited that doorstep screaming match to ruin Ruth's local reputation, knowing he could isolate her from the community.
He doxed his own wife. He purposefully set the emotional trap that the school gas explosion eventually ignited into a global firestorm.
He orchestrated her pariah status. And worse, much worse, Mrs. Henderson reports that Sam is verbally, emotionally, and psychologically abusing Lilith.
He keeps the world's greatest savant locked in a sterile annex, screaming at her to keep coding new features for Scraggy, telling her she is a worthless freak without his protection.
He is treating the greatest mind on the planet like a digital sweatshop worker.
So a rescue plan is formed in the shadows. It involves Josie, a brilliant and loyal solicitor named Mr. Tedda, and Mrs. Henderson acting as the physical conduit inside the house.
They realize they can't beat Sam's massive security and legal apparatus head-on.
They have to bypass it using the one thing Sam exploits, but fundamentally doesn't understand Lilith's mastery of the code.
Mrs. Henderson manages to slip a message to Lilith, convincing her that her mother is alive, loves her, and desperately needs her help.
Lilith, the savant who wrote Scraggy's foundational binary when she was 5 years old, sits at her terminal.
She doesn't just change a spreadsheet. She executes a dormant, highly complex poison pill protocol she had woven into the architecture years ago.
She effortlessly alters the company's internal digital ledger and corporate registry.
With a few keystrokes, she shifts the voting classifications of the shares, legally and undeniably, making herself the untouchable majority shareholder.
Overnight, while Sam sleeps, he loses all financial and operational control of the trillion-pound empire.
But they don't stop at just taking the money back. They ensure he can never hurt them again.
Mrs. Henderson secretly films Sam in the middle of one of his vicious, abusive tirades against Lilith.
She secures the footage, leaks it simultaneously to the global internet, and hands the raw files over to the authorities.
Given the horrific abuse on tape, combined with massive financial irregularities and fraud that Mr. Teta uncovers in Sam's ledgers, Sam is swiftly raided and arrested by special branch police.
His entire stolen empire collapses around him in a matter of days.
And as the final nail in Sam's coffin, an investigative reporter fed information by Josie publishes Ruth's private letters and Mrs. Henderson's testimony, fully exposing Sam's manipulation of Mrs. Fitzgerald.
The truth about the school tragedy and Ruth's innocence in the funding withdrawal finally comes out to the public.
Ruth is unequivocally cleared in the court of public opinion.
And most importantly, above the money and the vindication, she is reunited with Lilith. They are back together, in control of their lives, and slowly beginning the monumental task of moving forward.
It is a breathtaking, almost unbelievable reversal of fortune. But if we analyze the mechanics of her ultimate victory, it is incredibly telling.
Ruth's survival, her reclamation of her empire, and the rescue of her daughter wasn't due to her billions.
No, the money actually blinded her to predators like Sam. Her salvation was due entirely to human connection.
The deep, genuine bonds she formed with Josie, with Sally, and crucially the empathy she showed to Mrs. Henderson years prior.
Those human relationships were the true, resilient safety nets that actually caught her when the financial and social scaffolding of her life completely collapsed.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive into the life of Ruth Wright. Let's look back at the incredible bruising arc we've just traversed.
From an ordinary checkout girl at Tesco to the fiercely protective mother of a savant.
From absolute infinite wealth to the darkest, most tragic depths of a prison cell and a rusted bicycle.
And finally, a hard-won, fiercely fought redemption fueled by nothing but a mother's love.
It fundamentally challenges our modern perception of what constitutes true power. We are taught that wealth is armor.
But for Ruth, wealth isolated her, made her a massive target for societal rage and attracted predators. It was empathy, loyalty, and analog human connection that actually saved her life.
Exactly. And that is the connection I want to leave you with today. You listening to this right now, you will probably never build a trillion-pound AI in your living room.
You will probably never buy a 73 million pound floating fortress.
But you are building relationships every single day. The loyalty you cultivate in your everyday, ordinary life, the grace you show to a friend who is struggling, they help you offer a stranger when they have nothing to offer you in return.
That might be the very thing that saves you when the bottom inevitably falls out of your world.
And it leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder as we close. Lilith built an artificial intelligence capable of finding any answer in the world.
Scraggy could synthesize the entirety of human knowledge, logic, and history in milliseconds.
Yet that omnipotent, flawless algorithm couldn't predict the terrifying depths of human greed and betrayal that surrounded it in its own home.
Are our algorithms actually outsmarting us, or are they just blinding us to the fundamental human nature sitting right beside us?
It's the ultimate blind spot in our tech-obsessed culture. You think you're building a flawless blueprint for the future.
You think the whiteboard equations and the bank accounts will protect you from the chaos of life?
But in the end, when the blueprint shreds and you're navigating the dark without a compass, the only thing that works is the people who choose to stay in the boat with you. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.